Hello everyone and welcome back to my beginner guide series where I'm walking you through how to pilot these starter decks that you get shown at the beginning of your playthrough, and we're going to talk about how to pilot each of these. Last time we took a look at the green starter deck, and today we're going to be taking a look at red. Now I want to point out very briefly that if you are not seeing these cards here that I have, you actually have to do some hidden tutorial missions before you actually unlock these cards. So to get there, I'm going to go back to the main page here. If you click on play and you go over to adventure and then missions, you may have a lane, as they call it, that says tutorial missions or something like this. Obviously I did these a long time ago. And if you do all of these tutorial missions, you'll get a bunch of free card unlocks. And that's something that I would highly recommend doing before moving ahead too much, because you get these exact cards you see on screen here, as well as for the other starter decks as well. You get the blue package and the yellow package too. So definitely do those starter missions. This is different from the actual tutorial. I know you did a tutorial already, but there are more missions to do that unlock you these cards. It's not really a tutorial, it's more like just matches against the AI, so it's not too bad. But we're gonna take a look at this red starter list that they give you, and how to pilot this, and then later on I'm gonna show you some card choices, things that I would recommend you craft, and then swap out in this particular deck. But stick around to the end for that. Right now we're just going to talk about this list as is, and how to kind of play around this. So in the last video I mentioned that it's really important to look at your maximum land count, and you'll notice in this list that we actually have a maximum land count of 2 mountains only. Last time we had 3 forests, but this one is extremely cheap, only 2 mountains. So this means we're going to have to be extremely aggressive with our double neutrals. We want to build as little land as we possibly can. And then with only 2 mountain spaces available, we're going to have to get quite far up into our opponent's face to actually have relevant summoning locations. And the other thing to keep in mind is your starting creatures. So just pay attention to what can be played on turn 2 or earlier, which actually in this case is going to involve most of these cards. It's only cards like Ogre Battler and Red Devil, which are not going to be available to play on turn 2 or greater. Oh, and the Barbarian Ogre. But there is actually some cool little tech with these more expensive cards, where if you're player 2 and you have the Explore card, that's the card you get given as player 2, and it gives you a free prairie when you play it, and it gives you 2 free Faeria. And with that Explore card, you actually can play cards like Ogre Battler on turn 2, which can be very cool and a very interesting decision to make in your mulligan. But maybe we'll see that when we actually get into a match. Red Devil, on the other hand, this guy can be played on turn 3 as player 1, where you're gaining 3 Faeria each turn. So you can curve this out on turn 3, and sometimes that can be okay too, but these are sort of more complicated strategies that I'm not going to get too deep into in this video. The other thing you want to keep in mind is something I didn't mention in the last video, but I want to kind of spread these tips out throughout this series, so I'm not just shoving everything in one video. And but what I'll mention briefly in this video is the amount of starting creatures you include in your list. This is especially important when you start modifying it. The amount of starting creatures in your list should be somewhere between 9 and 10, perhaps. I mean, you can get as many as you like, really, but you don't want to drop below 9 starting creatures, that being cards that are playable turn 2 or earlier, because then you're going to run out of cards to actually play at the beginning of the game, and your opponent's just going to stomp all over you. So that's just a really important number that I like to keep in mind when I'm deck building. But yeah, this sort of list, as I mentioned, is going to be played very aggressively. Red has a lot of options to play aggressively because they've got pretty aggressive creatures, something like Kobold Warbeast, where it's a 4-cost 5/4. It's a reasonably sturdy body, but it's also quite an aggressive body as well. 5 power is a pretty decently large number in this game, especially on lower Faeria counts, like 4 and 3 and things. The other thing red has access to a lot of is the removal tricks, like Flame Burst, very powerful card in the game, always something you should be aware of when you're facing against a red player. This card can hit anything on the board for 3 damage, which is quite strong, and red just has a lot of options like this, a lot of removal options. The other thing it has access to is burn damage, and you'll hear me say that a lot throughout this series. Burn damage is just dealing damage to your opponent directly without having to do any combat hitting or anything. So cards like Rebel Slinger and stuff, they've got burn damage to it. And this particular list has a lot of things going for it. It's got aggressive cards, it's got really expensive big statted cards, and it's got like burn damage as well. So there's a lot of maybe convoluted things happening with this deck, but we're gonna brush this up at the end of this video. Let's get into a match though. I'll stop talking here and we'll actually get to see how this deck performs in action. Alright, we have our first opponent. I've actually played against this player on my main account. You may have noticed that I'm playing on a different account here, and that's just because this account has dropped down in the rankings, so I thought it would be a better example to play against similar players with similar decks. Real quick on the mulligan here, I'm going to probably actually full keep this. We've got a creature we can play on turn 1 here, and then the Kobold Beast, War Beast we can play later on. We are going second, you'll see at the top here. So when I'm going second, typically I want to play cards with very low land counts, something like a neutral creature. If I'm going first, I'd be a bit more comfortable just keeping the War Beast, tossing the Elder, just because I can get this out quicker as player 1. But in this case, we got the Village Elder. So same idea as before, I am going to be building towards the sides of my orb. And I probably am just going to start with double neutral here, just like we did in the last video, since I got that starting creature. Remember, we only have 2 mountains in this list, so we really want to push those 2 mountains as aggressively as possible. But we usually don't want to just race down the center here. I want to try to build the mountains. I want to build my land still across the wells, because my list has really expensive cards like the Ogre Battler and things. Now, here I have the option. I think I'm actually going to double neutral a second time. I have the option to start building mountains, but my opponent has decided to go to the opposite side, and this is a little bit of player knowledge right here, but I suspect that my opponent's playing kind of a combo-y deck, and so this makes me want to really push hard and get as fast up in my opponent's face as possible. I'm going to invest the Explorer here as well. You may have noticed I held that in my hand earlier. I think I might have mentioned in the last video how it's important to hold onto your cards as much as possible if they're not needed. But getting collectors as soon as possible is really good to have too. Yeah, so my opponent's actually playing on casual. You'll see this little yak symbol. This means they're playing on a casual, in casual mode. And casual players can be ranked with the actual... if you're at least on lower ranks, you can get matched with casual players. So I did mention how you should probably always play unranked to try and get more evenly matched opponents, but sometimes you can't always win. Sometimes you don't always get there. I'm going to build this mountain here. I want to try to keep my mountain, or all of my lands on the wells. You'll notice this a lot, especially if you watch experienced players. You want your lands to be on the wells so that you can summon creatures there. They don't get to collect immediately, sure, but on their following turn they get to collect, and then you get to move them off the well to fight stuff, which is very important. Now, ST0, this is a little bit more of an experienced player, I believe. I mean, as I mentioned, I think I've played against this player before on, like, God rank and things, so... we'll see what sort of type of list he's got in store for us. it does look like a kind of combo list where he's going to be playing cards like this Dreamkeeper here to cycle his hand and just keep reshuffling, and then this is going to combo with the Sky Captain here. So anytime he draws a flyer, they gain +1/+1. So we may or may not have quite the challenge actually with this type of list. We'll see how it goes, but we've got some good cards in this deck. We have some bad cards as well. Though I don't mind the hand I've been given here. So gonna build this second mountain now, and we're gonna put on as much pressure as we can and try and block my opponent from collecting off this well, actually. You want to try and stop your opponent from collecting as much as possible, as I think I've mentioned before. And to do so, often that means... that's another reason that this mountain is so good, too. We get to have a body blocking space. Now, I'm probably... I've got 16 Faeria here, which is a lot. So I'm probably going to play this Red Devil first, because this gives me mana or gives me Faeria back, right? This is a little bit more vulnerable a card, so yeah, but that's okay. I'm going to plant this guy here. Now there are 2 damage cards that exist in the game that are very popular, which I might get hit with in a second. So because I want to kind of play around removal here, I might actually play a Taunt instead of my big 7/7. And this is just going to further lock this guy down from collecting off of this well, which is something I'd like to do as much as possible. Unfortunately, my opponent's double collecting over here, and there's not much I can do about it. Until I top deck like a 1 damage source here, which is going to be very important. Ghost Dragon. Okay. Well, very spooky cards. That's going to be difficult to deal with. And my opponent plays the Haunted Husk. So, because this Husk has come down, I'm going to want to try not drawing very many cards, because I need to stay under this 4-card threshold. This is quite a complicated matchup, so hopefully this isn't too much. But basically, I'm just going to try to stay under this 4-card threshold as much as possible. And since my opponent is going to be playing really good, efficient cards like this 1-cost 7/1 protection Ghost Dragon, I need to hit my opponent in the face as much as possible to win this. And so, I'm probably going to end up going for this Barbarian Ogre then, just because it's the highest stat line I've got. I do have another Red Devil here, which, if I wanted to play for the value game, I would play this right now. Because this is I need to have 9 Faeria built up to play this, and I could always play this later. But in this particular matchup, where my opponent has a very strong late game, I need to try and turn up the gas a little bit. And so I'm going to play down my biggest creature possible here. And then I'm actually just going to +1. And then I actually might even consider Flame Bursting here, just to play out of Husk Threshold. It's not something I would recommend normally, but I think we're actually just going to go for it. Now, Flame Bursting face, in most circumstances, is a terrible play. But since I'm playing a kind of suboptimal deck here, I want to try and get as much tiny little value as I possibly can over my opponent. Now the second Husk comes down, which means I'm probably going to get Storytellered here, so unfortunately, the pre-Flame Burst did not pay off, but it was something I had to go for, I felt, just to put the pressure on. Actually, my opponent played into this Farm Boy here, which is kind of funny. I almost have a lethal here, which is interesting. I might end up drawing for that. I only have 13 damage, right? So I need 2 extra damage. I mean, I could draw or I could just +1 and play stuff. We go for the safe line and +1. So yeah, I just want to mention, never Flame Burst your opponent's face. That is never a good idea. I think in that situation, it was fine for the reasons I mentioned. I want to stay under threshold, and I'm playing a suboptimal deck. I want to gain as much little value as possible. But typically you want to hold that Flame Burst for the end game as much as you possibly can. But yeah, I'm just gonna whack face here. And we might actually have a pretty decent chance. I'm just gonna keep putting on the pressure, dumping as many creatures as possible. I am gonna +1, and just dump more creatures. We'll dump this Village Elder here. Now, the Village Elder is not gonna be able to do that much, but it might be able to kill like a body blocking creature with a combination of cards. I think we're actually probably okay though. There's not a lot my opponent can play here, except that. But it's not gonna really make a big difference unless my opponent can clear all of this. These two guys here. It's gonna search for it, but I don't think there's a card that exists that can really help here. This does help a little bit, where I can only hit once, so it might actually end up saving him a turn. Victory Celebration, eh? I know there's a lot of cards flashing by, things are going by pretty quickly, so most of you probably aren't familiar with the entire card pool yet. I would recommend, if you're wanting to actually view what these cards do in more detail, you can go to Faeria.org, which is a community-run card database for Faeria. It's not completely up to date, so be careful when you use that website, but most of the cards are up to date. So you can just type in, like, if I mention a card like Victory Celebration, you can type that card in Faeria.org to see what it actually does, if I'm not hovering it for you. Okay. We do not have a lethal, huh? I need a kill on this taunt here. I've got a Blazing Salamander, but that isn't exactly going to help. So what I might do is try and draw for it as much as possible. This is a good body blocker though, but yeah, let's try to draw for it. We'll hit in here. What I'm looking for, that is close. I'm looking for my second and only Flame Burst, which is pretty hopeful, I guess. I don't find it, so yeah, I mean, I can't really afford two things like that. I only have 12 damage. I got one more. It's close, but it's not quite there. I take a draw? We take the draw. Don't find it, but I am just gonna dump the taunt. And then we'll dump another taunt, sure. We'll get it eventually. And once again, I'm taunting my opponent out of this collection, which is very good to do. It just means my opponent has less resources to work with. There is the Steamforge I had in hand, which can be sometimes an appealing card, maybe. It looks kind of cool, you get so much value out of it. Typically Steamforge is not a very good card, though. One thing to keep in mind, too, is... So we actually won there, cool, didn't find an answer. One thing to keep in mind is... things like Steamforge, it's a 1 Faeria card. Very enticing to just drop whenever you feel like it. But in this game... Again, I'm going to mention this for probably the millionth time now. It's very different from games like Magic and Hearthstone, where they have this mana refresh system. Your mana resets every turn, so you're encouraged to spend as much of that as possible, is what I'm trying to get at here. In Faeria, that does not happen. Faeria is cumulative, which brings up some other implications, such as it's very important not to spend your Faeria on really tiny things like Steamforge, because that really tiny bits of Faeria can add up over the course of a game. So if you spend 1 Faeria in the early game playing that Steamforge, that might come back to bite you in the late game where you're desperate for that 1 extra Faeria to just close out the game and win. And these are things that are very difficult to figure out and analyze when you first start the game, especially if you don't have anyone telling you these things. But good match. Hopefully you learned a lot from that. You saw that we went super aggressive. Only 2 mountains were built that game. That's great. And if we had gone for more lands, I think we actually would have lost that match. So very subtle things, hard to notice, but hopefully you'll learn these subtleties as you go along. Let's go back to the deck builder though real quick. Okay, now that we're done our match, let's talk about some improvements we can make to this red starter deck. Make it a little bit better. And then I'll talk about the end goal for a mono-red type of list to make it a bit more competitively viable. But in terms of cards you want to craft for this type of list, let's just take a look through the rarities of cards. We did this last time just because you don't get to craft all the cards right at the beginning of the game, right? You only get to craft commons first, then rares, then epics. So in terms of commons, I would definitely take a look at cards like Underground Brigand. Very strong card. This is actually S tier in my opinion. This has ridiculous amounts of value. I know it doesn't look like much, but this is a real powerhouse in a game. Just because it's a 3-cost 2/3, but every time that it enters combat, you gain 2 Faeria. So it's going to most likely enter combat at least once in a game, and when that happens, you kind of net back almost all of this creature's cost. So it almost becomes like a 1-cost 2/3, which is insane for what this is, and it's only a 2-land card. So Underground Brigand, I would right away just draft 3 of these. This is like one of the best red cards that exist. Aside from this, another thing you should kind of be looking towards is what sort of archetype you want this deck to be going towards. I know you guys probably don't know a ton about like archetypes and things, but what I mean by this is, do you want to be super aggressive? Do you want to play big boys like the Barbarian Ogre, or do you want to go down the burn route that Rebel Slinger would suggest? Typically when you're deck building, you want to build towards only one of these sort of archetypes that I kind of listed, because if you're trying to spread out and do too many archetypes at once, your deck's just going to fall flat. And that's kind of what this red starter deck does, in my opinion. It's trying to do too many things. It's got the big boys, it's got some aggressive pieces, it's got some removal pieces, and then it's got some burn just thrown in there for some reason. And really, to make things like this work, you have to go all in on that. Now, because this list only has really 1 burn card, being this Rebel Slinger, there are several burn cards in the game, like Cypher's Fodder and things, Cypher's Wrath you'll see later. Because of this, I'm probably thinking about tossing these cards first. These are the first ones that get the boot. And similar to the mono green list, I would also take a look at booting cards like Village Elder, Farm Boy, and Steamforge I would get rid of as well. Cards like Steamforge Enforcer, you'll notice this card exists in every starter deck out there. This card is actually not terrible at the beginning of your playthrough. At a competitive level, this card sucks, but while you're building up your card collection, I would actually keep these cards in your list, because they actually do a lot. Like, they spend a lot of your resources that you're building up, which you can get up a lot of, and it just produces a decently aggressive creature on the board. So I'd keep these in for a while until you actually get some really good cards to put in this list. But what I'm going to try and gear this deck towards is more of a mid-range focus, with kind of cards like Kobold Warbeast I would keep around, and Underground Brigand. Try to go for a value game plan, but also still be quite aggressive. Flameburst, a very good card as well. So in terms of what cards we want to craft, the Firebomb actually is reasonably solid. Now, I probably wouldn't waste too many crafting charges on a card like this, but if you do get this from packs, I would include these. Firebomb, you might see this as like a 4-cost 4 damage. Flameburst is a 3-cost 3 damage, so, I mean, what's the difference? It's basically doing the same thing. Flameburst, very strong card. This is actually also an S tier card in my opinion. Firebomb, a lot less so. This I would actually drop all the way down to like a C tier, and the reason for that is because 1 Faeria makes a massive difference in this game. Just that 1 Faeria difference. As I mentioned before, how you don't want to just spend one fairy on like a Steam Forge, because you may be hurting for it later in the match. Similar idea, but it also comes down to HP thresholds in the game. There's a lot of 3 HP thresholds that are quite cheap things. Firebomb, I mean, there are a lot of 4 HP things too, but I think there's more so 3 HP. The Flame Burst is more flexible to going face. Another thing to consider is you gain 3 Faeria per turn, so you can more effectively afford 3 Faeria cards than you can 4 Faeria cards. Anyways, that's a few reasons, but Firebomb's still a solid card if you just have them in your collection. Throw them in there, get rid of some of these garbage cards like Rebel Slinger. Now, Ogre Dance is a very solid card if you're going down a particular route. So a random card in your hand costs 7 less. You'll notice in this starter deck we've got like Barbarian Ogre, Ogre Battler, Red Devil. Ogre Dance, very fantastic card if you're running a lot of these big things. It is random, so you want to ideally only use this card when you only have 7 cost or higher creatures in your hand. Otherwise, it's just not going to do very much. So if you want to go down that route, definitely consider the Ogre Dance. But apart from that, Underground Boss kind of is doing a similar thing that the Underground Brigand is doing. I would definitely recommend crafting 3 copies of this. This is not as good as the Brigand, believe it or not, even though it's bigger stat line. The Underground Brigand, for its cost, just is more efficient. Like, the math just works out to be more efficient, but Boss, still a fantastic card. I would definitely include 3 copies of this, 3 copies of the Brigand. These burn cards, like Shed Embrute, these ones are not very good, but again, if you want to go down that burn route, then you could consider cards like this, but just try and go for only one archetype, as I mentioned. So if you want to go burn, sure. I mean, just go all in on burn, though. Put in all the burn cards you can in your list. Boss, very good card, though. And then that's about it from the commons, at least for the type of list that I would recommend going for. Again, if you want to do, like, the big boy things, you could include more of those, and Bold Bargainer helps that package as well. And this is for these sort of bargain type of list. But let's quickly take a look at rares. So right away in rares, this is where your meat is going to be for the red package. On this first page here, there are 3 exceptionally powerful cards in the game. One I've already talked about, which is Flame Burst. So definitely include 3 copies of this in your list. Another one is Cypher's Wrath. I would also definitely include 3 copies of this in your list. And the reason is not so much for the if it dies, deal 2 damage to its controller, but the 2 Faeria 2 damage is a very clean threshold, and a very strong one as well. Just a really strong card. Similar reason to why Firebomb isn't as good as Flame Burst. Cypher's Wrath is just that much cheaper. But these 2 cards do similar things, just because Flame Burst can also optionally go face and hit structures and things. But Cypher's Wrath, Flame Burst, I would try to include max copies of both of these, and then Axe Grinder as well is a very strong red card. I would definitely include 3 copies of this in your list too. The red starter list actually, I mean, it's okay, but it's just, there's so much potential that this list could have being in the red sort of color, and it's just missing so many cards from it. So I think out of any of the 4 starter decks, you're going to want to be crafting the most for this red starter list. So be wary of this. There's just like so many red cards that are very good to craft. Axe Grinder being one of them. It has this little bonus here where if he's summoned adjacent to an opponent's well, that's the top 2 wells when you are looking at your board. And this buff is very powerful, obviously, but buff aside, this card is just good anyways. It's a 1 land card, 3 cost 4/3. This alone, without card text, is already solid. So you can play this as a starting creature, dump it down on turn 1, it's an excellent collector, or in the late game, it's just an excellent card as well, because it becomes a 3-cost 5/4, which is absurd. Now always keep in mind, I mentioned starting creatures, I would keep it to 9, let's say 9 plus for starting creatures. So as you take away some of these cards like Village Elder and Rebel Slinger and Guard and stuff, just try and remember how many starting creatures you have, and try not to dump yourself below 9 starting creatures, because you're going to be hurting if you do that. Other cards here, Herald of War is pretty solid. I would consider crafting these, especially if you're putting in a lot of combat cards like the Underground, Brigand, and Boss. This can be pretty solid. Grimguard is okay in a burn archetype. I probably wouldn't run this in a mid-range thing where you're doing value. All of these cards that have combat deal 2 damage to your opponent, they need to be played in a burn archetype to be any good. And even at that, they're like, okay. I will say though, if you're on the lower ends of the Faeria ranks, burn goes a lot further. The games are a lot slower down at the lower ranks, so I shouldn't be so quick to dismiss burn, because this can actually be pretty powerful at lower ranks. So maybe that is a consideration, but remember, just go for 1 archetype. And then apart from that, Rikoacopter, very strong card. This has a good AoE potential, but it also is just good single target damage if you really want to. This can deal 2 damage to something, and then you still get a 3/3 flying creature, which is very strong as well. It is a DLC card, so you may or may not have access to that. In terms of epics, there are some cards here that are okay. Bombslinger especially is very good at lower ranks. This isn't very good competitively. Well, it's still decent competitively. I wouldn't rule this card out yet, but as a new player, this card's very strong. So I would definitely consider the Bombslingers in crafting, but even more so, I would consider this card. This is probably the best red card in the game. I feel like I said that about Brigand, but it might be on par with the Brigand in terms of power level. Deal 1 damage to all enemies when this enters is just so strong, and then you also get that 5/6 body on top of it. This is a must draft if you have some crafting charges available and you have epics available for crafting. Draft 3 of these, like, immediately. This is one of the best cards in the game, let alone cards in red. So definitely draft 3 copies of this. Firestorm is an okay card as well. For some AoE damage, it is selective AoE damage. It does it in a cluster of hexes. But in terms of from epics, that's about it. The only other card I would consider is from neutral, which is the Horsemaster, which you've actually seen a lot of. And for some reason, the Horsemaster actually isn't in this red starter list, but it is in like 2 of the other starter decks. But red creatures are quite slow, and they're not as beefy as green creatures are, so they can't get away with just playing super passive all of the time. You kind of need to be a lot more aggressive as the red player, and Horsemaster really helps with this, because this, I mean, obviously lets you charge 3 and zip around the map a lot quicker. So you start the game with 2 copies of this Horsemaster. I would honestly include these right away in your deck. Get rid of these Rebel Slingers, throw in the Horsemasters, and maybe even consider crafting a 3rd copy of the Horsemaster in the future too. I'll put a list on screen right now as well to a more competitive mono-red deck. This is something that you could consider building up towards. As you build up even more and more cards in your collection, it'll take a while to craft all of these cards and things, so don't worry about it too much. But red combat, very strong in the competitive meta. I would definitely consider crafting all of those cards that I talked about to try and get there. Horsemaster, as you can see there too, very strong card just to get up more aggressively. And then we also have that Herald of War, which I kind of glossed over, but this card is pretty strong when you're pairing them with the other combat creatures. But anyways, hopefully you got some value out of that. And next time, we're going to talk about the blue starter list, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you guys over in that next one.